So that leaves me to introduce you our today's speakers. So we have Garath Duffy. He's Director of Supply Chain and Project Management at our Austrian site in Rankweil. And we have Oliver Okle. He's Product and Service Manager at our headquarters in Ravensburg, Germany. So that's all from my side. I wish you an interesting session, and I'm handing over to my colleague, Oliver.
Thank you, Thomas, for this nice introduction and also a warm welcome from my side. So the topic of this webcast is getting the first batch right. But before we start with this topic, I have a question to all of you. We all know that there can be bottlenecks in clinical filling, and we think it's important to know these crucial points and how to avoid them. So therefore my question, according to the FDA, what do you think is the most frequent reason why an IND is put on clinical hold? Is it A, the toxicological part, for example, with insufficient justifications for the exposure level? Can there be problems in the quality part with stability or impurity profiles? Or are there topics in the clinic, for example, unaddressed toxicities or concerns in the dosing sequence? Please feel free and use the chat box on the right and give me your answer. So is it A, toxicology, B, the quality, or C, clinic? Okay, the first answers just arrived. I give you 5 minutes, not really. Okay, we have some answers and the most answers are B. And you're right. The most important part of the most often mentioned point is the quality. Because according to the FDA, the main reason why the IND are rejected are the quality issues. So quality is really the topic where you have to focus on if you want to be successful with your clinical fill. But what does this mean for you and your today's parenteral clinical filling program? Of course, we all know that it is important to get to clinic as soon as possible, as time is money. And especially if an investor is on board, it is important to achieve milestones on time. Otherwise, you can see an impact on your funding and resources, resulting in a decrease of your efficiency. But nevertheless, quality is really the key, and it has to be your priority number one. If the quality doesn't fit, you will lose your batch, and with it a lot of time, money, and maybe also the trust of your investors. So you really have to focus on this quality topic. So we are here today to help you with some of these topics and will answer the following questions therefore. What do you have to do to keep the quality first approach? Where do you have to focus on and what should be your priorities? And what are important steps to take and questions to ask within your filling project? And with this, I will hand over to my colleague Garath, who will answer you all these questions.
Hey folks, thank you Oliver, and thank you everyone for your time today, and hi from lovely sunny Rankweil in Austria. So as Oliver mentioned, we'll cover kind of the key aspects around sterile injectable and clinical drug product manufacturing today. More specifically, we're going to dive into each and every little section of it and focus on some questions and key steps that you should be thinking about and asking whenever you're looking for selecting the right partner. Okay. So let's start off with looking at some of the general scopes and scope pieces that you'll see within that early phase project, focusing solely on DP manufacturing at this stage. So we start off typically with a project kickoff. So you've already selected your partner, you're getting into finding and aligning with the different SMEs along the way on project scope, deliverables, technical aspects, and timelines. And here it's really critical to lay the ground rules for how you want to communicate and also start to build that relationship with your partner. Once you've gone through that, you'll start to think about material specifications, material needs that you'll need throughout that, discussing technical transfer documents, selecting primary packaging components, and discussing how your process will be implemented at that CDMO site. You'll need to think about analytical testing, and you'll start to transfer those methods accordingly. And oftentimes you'll be running technical batches or pilot batches to prepare yourself for that first GMP batch. After you've shown GMP readiness through that, you'll get into the actual GMP manufacturing, followed by testing, release, and shipment to begin that first clinical trial. Along the way, you'll start to have thoughts about filing documentation and getting that regulatory piece locked up, but that's coming later. Some questions that you want to think about during this planning phase that you need to ask early to avoid delays later on and protect that overall timeline is really, what do I need to source and from where? Sorry, that was wrong. So what is a realistic timeline? It's really important from the start to align on a realistic timeline for the scope of work needed for that clinical manufacturing. We'll talk about some of the factors that affect that later on. What are regulatory agencies going to be asking you? What's my strategy? It's a good idea to get submission advice early from agencies. Do you know what countries you plan to file in? This is important because the CDMO that you're going to be working with may have specific testing requirements, for example, for components or for finished goods, and the manufacturing controls involved may be different for different countries. Start thinking early about that. What do I already know about the manufacturing process? Is it scalable? Have I performed any small scale or lab studies at this stage? Is more development work needed to really start to characterize my product? Start thinking early about that one. What more do I need to know about my API at this stage? You know, we've had it in the lab scale for a long time, so I already have some information about it. Can it be handled safely? You know, is my formulation truly locked down? Do I have some stability data available to show that? Have I looked into sensitivities, light, temperature, oxygen, shear stress, and so on? Do I have data on viscosity, solubility? You know, what data will help me to help my CDMO put the best manufacturing process together? What do I need to source and from where? Resources, materials, for example, filters, excipients, primary packaging components. Sourcing those and making sure there's a robust supply chain in place for those will help to lock down your lead times and make sure you're not facing delays later on. We'll talk in more detail about these and other points in the following slides, but let's start with API. API being your most important raw material throughout the whole process. It's what you bring into the process for your CDMO, and let's look at some key questions around that. So up to now, you've learned an awful lot about your API at a lab scale in your own lab, but now it's time to let go a little bit to some extent. It's about to graduate and move on, and that brings specific challenges and issues with it. For example, things such as thaw times, equilibration time, hold times. These are all aspects that will need to be evaluated, characterized, and challenged, all while operating under more strict GMP guidelines at a manufacturing scale. How is your DS going to be delivered to your fill-finish CDMO? That's a question that needs to be clarified very, very early. Many products come fully formulated and ready to fill. They simply need to be thawed, maybe pooled, mixed, and filled, while others will require formulation by your fill-finish CDMO to hit a target concentration. Have you defined your formulation yet? Can you define and provide guidance on this process? At scale, for example, thawing, pH adjustment, filtration, everything takes longer and requires appropriate consideration. You may need additional lab studies to get it behind that. Sensitivities. Do I know anything about my API that could be relevant for my CDMO partner? Do I have concerns about handling that should be shared to make sure that that manufacturing process is set up to minimize any potential risks and eliminate them even? What do we know about how our API needs to be handled? Are we concerned about operational exposure limits, or is the mechanism of action potentially challenging for handling, or does it require additional containment systems? These are things that can be relevant for your CDMO and will certainly impact timeline if we don't address them early. Have we identified all of the required ingredients? The excipients that may be needed for dilution, anything that's exotic in there may require additional testing, additional lead times for delivery. So try to stay as normal as you can. If the CDMO is not able to supply those, am I capable as a customer of supplying them in a GMP ready condition to my CDMO? And sourcing. Do I have flexibility in which suppliers I can use, in which degrees of standards of quality I can use? If I'm too rigid at this stage, that'll remove flexibility further downstream and obviously have a timeline impact. So moving on from our API, let's look at the next step in the process, getting that API and that product into a vial. Obviously, in early phase manufacturing, the vial is the go-to component. It gives you the most flexibility in terms of dosing and so on, but it's never too early to start thinking about the life cycle of your drug product, right through to commercialization. The vials do give you the highest degree of flexibility right now, but most commercial products find themselves in syringes, cartridges, or some sort of injection device. Patient compliance can be improved, and syringes at this stage of development can increase the value of your product in the clinical phase by making it more marketable to potential licensees. So it's never too early to start thinking about it. However, the caveat in that is that you may be tied down to some extent later on to the packaging combination you select at this stage, and require additional work and time later on in the life cycle if you want to transition into another platform. So always think long-term and big scale. So looking at your container itself, what kind of questions do you want to think about asking me at this stage? What is really truly the optimal container for my product? If you know your dosing regimen at this stage, it may be advantageous to move beyond a vial. There are significant savings in time and development by doing this early, even as early as phase 2. It has a little bit more of a challenge at this stage, but can save you up to 18 months later on. If you're planning for an injector, then start these discussions early. Decisions that you make, moving to syringe, may dictate the options you have later on. Can your CDMO support sourcing material components that you need? And can it deliver a drug product with the required specifications if you're moving into a device later on? Stopper position, for example, air bubble size. Things we need to align on with all different parties. What customs challenges should we expect? Pulling in components from several different suppliers means that you're dealing with several different countries, international shipment. Are there any import-export regulations, issues, fees, or licenses associated with moving that material internationally? Clarifying this early can help avoid delays when time becomes critical. Do we need any non-standard container components? Anything that's non-standard, such as a specific syringe, specific quality of that, specific rubber formulation for a stopper, this could have significant impact to timelines for sourcing as well as qualification or implementation if your selected partner CDMO hasn't processed these in the past. If there's no specific quality-driven need, then it's really best to stick with standard as much as possible. And can our partners source the components that we need? Can your CDMO really source the necessary components? Ideally, yes. But if your selection is not something you can source, then options become limited, and you may find yourself in the role of procuring components and getting them shipped to him. Be prepared for them. So considering a syringe earlier, as early in the process as possible, can help. If we look at the numbers here, 18 months in terms of a head start, just on your development timelines, obviously saves money. You reduce API losses potentially by having a lower overfill, for example, in a syringe can give you a 2% yield per batch increase that can have a significant dollar value at the end of the day. And obviously the increase in marketability, patient compliance and so on of your product from a licensing perspective. So now we've selected our primary packaging component, our API is in there. How do we make sure we're hitting the right quality attributes as we've laid them down? Let's have a look into the analytical testing piece. At the early clinical phase, it's not necessarily required to have fully validated methods in place, but you want to make sure you have robust and phase appropriately qualified methods to test what you want to test. So your CDMO is going to make quality decisions based on testing results at this stage, best to make sure it's accurate. So at this stage, customers have often developed and qualified methods either internally at the DS manufacturer or even at a third-party lab. And now may not be the best time to invest the time, money, and material necessary to transfer more complex product-specific methods to their fill-finish CDMO. Expect to perform sterility and bioburden testing at an absolute minimum, and there are quite high material demands required for these method transfers, so always keep that in mind. All other analytics beyond that are at your discretion. So this is the typical scope on the left, as you can see here, of analytics that can be performed at a fill-finish manufacturer. Having said that, subvisible particle or even particle testing is becoming ubiquitous at this stage with new Annex 1 requirements, and they focus heavily on particulates at the minute. So how are these methods transferred to your CDMO? There's different approaches based on the complexity of the method. Are they compendial tests or more product specific? So an example of a paper-based simple transfer is a compendial appearance test. Doesn't require any material, is relatively quick, and can be done purely paper-based. Where we need some more matrix testing is, for example, with pH or particulate matter, also compendial testing, but with some verification required. An in-process test, for example, a UV for protein concentration, will require comparative testing to make sure we have material available with a defined concentration to share with my CDMO for that method transfer. And looking at the microbiological methods, their validation is required, and there are quite high, let's say, material demands for that. You want to make sure you have the conversations with your CDMO early to understand both the time and material requirements for these transfers. It's also critical to get an understanding of when these transfers can take place, parallel to fill finish, where they can become rate limiting, or can I get them out of the way earlier with comparative material that I can send ahead of time to get that transfer feasibility testing done to avoid delays later on. Having a deeper dive into this, let's look at questions around analytical methods. So have we defined our analytical SOPs? Do we have appropriate analytics in place to test and monitor my drug product throughout the process? To define really what I want to know. Have we knocked out a defined space within our product profile? At this stage, you probably won't have critical quality attributes locked down and characterized, but you'll start defining them now and use data that's gathered today to establish these parameters. So set up testing today to capture everything you want to know tomorrow to help define that product profile. Are our methods in transfer-ready form? Do we have our SOPs and qualified methods that can be handed off to our CDMO for that transfer? And if the method is implemented at a third party, does the legal framework you have established allow you to share that detail with your CDMO? Locking in the right partnerships on contracting. These are some questions you should be asking CDMO partners, and the answer for most of these, if not all of them, should be yes. You may not. Can you handle our product and drug substance safely? You won't have a lot of tox data at this stage, but there will be some safety evaluation required by your CDMO. So start thinking about that. Does the quality system meet your quality team's expectations? You'll obviously cover this in your quality audit, but it's important to think about this now. Can you perform our testing methods? Is your CDMO equipped and staffed to meet our in-process and release testing requirements? Do you have experience with our drug substance class? Do they regularly manufacture and release biologics, peptides, oligonucleotides? Ask them for their experience and history with those to make sure they're robust. Can you source and process our packaging configuration? So can this source the necessary packaging materials, filters, excipients? What are the lead times and resupply times? How do you guarantee security of supply? in these troubled times? And do you have available filling slots when we need them? How much flexibility is there? How do I reserve a fill slot? What happens in the event of delay? How much flexibility can we both expect from each other? And finally, and most typically, and most critically, are the proposed timelines realistic? Ask for track record, most common reasons for delays, and how these risks are mitigated typically in running projects. So some more, let's say, resource-related questions. Well, often it seems that the time leading up to kickoff itself is longer than the project duration itself, and there are several suppliers in the mix, all of which can require contracts and agreements to be in place before you can start negotiating. This can lead to a long lead up to project start before actual work can begin. So how many partners do you need? Are there additional services that you may need other partners to complete? Stability testing, for example, packaging. What's the exact scope of work that we need to talk about? It's important to talk about the full scope of what's being quoted for this individual supplier. Make sure that expectations are aligned with your partner services. Don't be afraid to ask for more. Often your fill finish CDMO can provide those services themselves or have partners within their network that can help. What resources will we need for formal audits? This is key. You'll make sure you'll need external consultants or additional help from maybe even a QP who can help you with this audit. It's important to get those locked down in time. Looking at quality agreements and more specifically even service agreements, what do you need to be specifying in those? Delineating responsibilities and making sure all parties are aligned. As always, communication is key in these things, so defining pathways for communication here is essential. All partnerships are based on open early communication, particularly around that expectations, timelines, risks, and how challenges will be handled if and when they arise. So after all of these considerations we've looked at up till now, what should you expect in working with a CDMO on your first clinical product manufacturing? To get an idea of the, let's say, the duration of the activities that can typically happen from kickoff up until batch release, here's an example of a standard liquid vial fill. Generally, you should target 3 to 6 months from kickoff until first fill. This is obviously dependent on scope and could be longer if additional development activities are needed. After kickoff and a final scope check, we'll immediately begin with transfer of analytical methods. We'll start setting up material specifications for incoming goods to allow receipt and release of your drug product for processing. In parallel, we'll be drafting process development specification documentation, which are the tech transfer documents that precede master batch records, where we knock down all of the process parameters and key steps within that process to make sure we're performing manufacturing accurately. This process needs to be completed well ahead of manufacturing, typically around 4 weeks. Drug substance should also be provided to the CDMO around 4 weeks prior to manufacturing to allow incoming goods checks to be completed and that release to take place, depending on scope. Very often, the first batch that we fill is a technical batch where we confirm GMP readiness and verify all of the assumptions that are made in that process world. And then typically following on from that, the GMP batch, around 6 to 12 weeks afterwards, depending on the scope of testing and evaluation, we'll be ready for GMP manufacturing. That'll allow us to make any updates to the process, to testing and so on, prior to going into GMP manufacturing. Downstream of that, typically target around 30 days for release of the batch, and then the material is ready for shipment. So from, let's say, initial kickoff and last scope check up until the release of that GMP material to be ready for shipment to the clinic, we're talking 6 to 10 months. So be realistic about that. Key process questions at this stage to keep in the back of your mind. How much API will you need? Typically, it's never enough. You'll want to know your CDMO's predicted line losses, typical reject rates, sample requirements, and ultimately how many units you'll get and need for the trial. Providing that input and getting that information from the CDMO will help you define how much API you'll need and how much you have available to see where you start to need to cut corners sometimes. It can be easy to underestimate volumes required, so enter into an open discussion with your partner as to what's realistic. Do we have time and API for a technical run? It's typically a common question, especially for the first batch, which can be very, very time critical. It's highly recommended to ensure GMP readiness, to really lock in filling tolerances, mixing parameters, etc., to really de-risk that first GMP manufacturing. But typically time and material is not readily available. So get an idea from your CDMO what risks can be mitigated with small scale work perhaps, and really getting an idea for the risk appetite on both sides. What's the appropriate processing time for our product? Is your product stable at specific temperatures for the necessary times required for thawing, compounding, filling, visual inspection, packaging, and final storage? Does your data align with your CDMO's process capabilities? Be open and honest about concerns. Better at this stage to put tighter controls in place to avoid quality issues downstream. If your product is frozen, what distribution resources do you need to secure? Frozen DP becomes a big issue the further along the supply chain you go. So could a reformulation or lyophilization be considered? Because there are additional considerations needed for storage, shipment, and along the life cycle, as I said, this becomes more complex and more tightly controlled. How long will it take to release my batch? The final deliverable and key step to getting your product out of the door for the clinic is this. And it's key to ask that question to make sure you're setting up your timeline realistically for all parties concerned. Okay. That covered all of my points for today. Hopefully I've been able to give you some insight and input into where we are and what you need to be thinking of. And I'll hand back to Oliver. Thank you, Oliver.
So thank you, Garath, for your valuable insights. As you now know more about the whole process and the important milestones and things to consider, I would like to give you now more information about Vetter's development service and therefore the way we directly can support you and your way to successful first batch filling. So Vetter is a global leading contract development and manufacturing organization. We offer comprehensive support for your injectable product from the early clinical to launch and life cycle. What is important for us? At every step, we offer a wide range of analytical services and, of course, regulatory support so that you have an expert partner at your side from the preclinical to the commercial. To be able to support you as best as possible, we have dedicated clinical manufacturing facilities in the EU, Germany, and Austria, and in the US near Chicago. In addition, we have also sales offices in the US, EU, and as well the APAC region. In Austria, our facility is specialized in filling liquid and lyophilized vials for the preclinical phase 1 and phase 2. In Chicago, we also have an up-to-date facility for vial and syringe filling for preclinical and early clinical projects. And when it comes to phase 3 and launch projects, our site in Ravensburg is in charge. In Ravensburg, we can fill vials, cartridges, syringes, and special dual chamber systems. So we can offer the primary packaging material that fits best to your API. Our clinical and commercial sites have a wide experience when it comes to different substance classes and therapeutics areas. We fill products from diseases like cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, but also for ophthalmics and orphan drugs. We can handle antibodies, proteins, oligonucleotides, and many others, and got the long-term experience in filling them. So, in fact, over 80% of our customers' products are complex and sensitive biologics. What is important to know about us? We not only have a wide experience with all types of substance classes, but we also offer comprehensive support throughout the entire product development process up to launch and beyond. We have different departments with a specialized team that provide you with exactly the support and knowledge you need at every stage of your product development. So my colleagues from early clinical development will support you with the knowledge from preclinical to phase 2 and make sure that your first batch is filled in the required quality. When it comes to phase 3 and beyond, my colleagues from late stage development will take over until your product is launched. As our departments work very closely together and have long-term experience with scale-ups, clinical production, and the necessary analytics and regulatory issues, we can make sure that the transfer and the scale-up process runs as smoothly as possible. To give you an idea what this means, I brought some figures with me. So we have a global customer base and fill for small biotech as well as for big pharma customers. At the moment, we have more than 180 ongoing clinical projects from preclinical to phase 3, and we work with a lot of small biotech clients. So at the moment, around 70% of our customers have less than 200 employees. More than 35% of our clinical customers fill multiple compounds with us, which of course makes us a little bit proud as it shows that they trust us and are satisfied with our services. Since the opening of our clinical manufacturing site in Chicago 2011, we supported more than 130 customers and processed more than 300 different compounds and had more than 40 successful transfers to late-stage development in Ravensburg. So that was a lot of information for today, I think. I hope it was interesting for you and you can take a lot of interesting points with you. As at last, I just want to summarize what makes Vetter special and why we could be your trusted partner when it comes to your first clinical batch. We have a deep expertise when it comes to biologics and a proven regulatory track record. And we have a wide range of up-to-date packaging strategies, for example, also to the dual chamber systems. In addition to this, we are also a significant troubleshooting expert with facilities in the EU as well in the US. So my colleague and I thank you very much for attending this webcast. And if you have questions, Garath and I will be happy to answer them now.